Roots HR, as I say, I'm CEO and lead consultant of Roots HR, and we're a specialist consultancy for human resources within the social sector. We've been going since 2009. We're actually a social enterprise ourselves, and we provide HR services purely to other social sector organisations, so other not-for-profit charities, social enterprises, other not-for-profit type organisations. And we're delivering this session as part right at the start of Volunteers Week, free of charge, which is funded by our Social Impact Fund as part of our social purpose, which is to hopefully improve the management of people within the social sector workforce. So this webinar is being delivered through our Social Impact Fund as part of our social purpose as a social enterprise. Can I say social any more times? So just in terms of our agenda for today, hopefully by the end of the session you should have an awareness of the legal framework when engaging and managing volunteers, understand what your organisation's responsibility and obligations are to volunteers, think about and how to manage volunteer expectations, and sort of have an awareness of how to manage volunteers on a day-to-day basis, including sort of resolving concerns or conflicts. So that's what we're going to go through. As I say, if you have any questions as we go through, if you can pop them in the Q&A, and then once we've gone through the slides, we'll switch the recording off and then we'll dive into the questions. So I'm going to start by looking at what do we mean by volunteer, and sort of just looking at what does volunteering look like at the moment across the UK. So volunteers typically give time and they carry out activities that aim to benefit our community or society, and it could be looking at community or society at a national, regional, sort of local level. And volunteers are unpaid, and typically they choose how they want to give their time. And people will choose to volunteer for a variety of different reasons, including perhaps, sense of public duty, desire to improve situations for others or for themselves, or perhaps, for enhancing their own career prospects, developing skills, etc. But in terms of what volunteering looks like and feels like at the moment, and there is a report, the Time Well Spent report, which is coming out later on this month. It's not actually coming out this week. I think it's towards the back end of this month. It'll be published through the NCVO, which is sort of looking at the current state of volunteering within the UK. And obviously what we're seeing is that potentially through the COVID pandemic and obviously into cost of living, there have been some changes in terms of the state of volunteering in the UK, if you like. So levels of formal volunteering have sort of really dropped significantly. So we had 16.3 million people typically volunteered formally, so through a group, a club or an organisation in 2020 and 21, and that was significantly down from the year before. Now obviously that's COVID time, so it may be that issues, things were put on pause as we went into various sort of lockdowns, but there was a sort of significant drop in formal volunteering in the early stages of the pandemic. And volunteering, I guess, has sort of changed slightly as well. I guess it's got a slightly different look now. We all had to switch up into different ways of working through the pandemic. A lot of things moved online and a lot of things have stayed online. So some volunteering that may have been face-to-face perhaps moved to sort of online or remote or telephone, support lines, etc. But also, volunteering, there's perhaps been a rise in micro volunteering, so people who might volunteer for a specific single task or project. But also, obviously, we've seen different mobilisation of different sort of volunteering efforts through things like supporting support for Ukraine through the war, etc. In terms of sort of volunteering, the overall sort of likelihood of people wanting to continue to volunteering did decline as well. So it was up at 80% in 2018, down to 77% in 2020. So volunteer participation perhaps has not recovered through sort of COVID, and actually, you know, perhaps through COVID, but also other circumstances, people's inclination to continue to volunteer has dropped as well. So thinking about sort of the impact of the pandemic and cost of living crisis, it's also noticeable that volunteers are now more likely to think that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. There was 19% of respondents around sort of the time well spent report in 2018 said they felt that their volunteering was becoming too much like paid work. That's increased to 26% in 2022. Now, again, that could be, you know, issues around costs that have come up through the pandemic and into the cost of living crisis, and the impact that's had on organisations that have meant perhaps they've tried to fill gaps in the workforce with volunteers. The knock-on effect is that some volunteers are feeling like their volunteering role is becoming a bit too much like paid work. Perhaps there's too much that's being asked of them, perhaps in time, effort, etc. And more volunteers are starting to feel like the volunteering group or organisation that they're volunteering for had sort of more unreasonable expectations of how much they do. So perhaps the level of time that they're giving. So that was 17% in 2018 and has increased to 24% in 2022. So I think that the data is kind of telling us that we need to not just think about how we recruit volunteers, but also how we retain them, because there seems to be some consensus or a higher consensus among those who are volunteering that too much is now being requested of them, or perhaps they're feeling like the volunteering role that they're doing is starting to become more like paid work, and that might be to do with the obligations that they're feeling that they're being put under. And that's an important thing for us to focus on, because obligations can have an impact in terms of what the employment status of a volunteer could be. But there's more data that will come out in the time well spent report, but we can see that there's a sort of slight shift in volunteering. There's perhaps fewer people starting to volunteer, people who are volunteering less inclined to continue volunteering, people who are volunteering perhaps feeling like their roles are becoming much more of a paid role, so perhaps those level of expectation on them is very high, and the sort of nature of volunteering might be sort of changing. So rather than the sort of formal ongoing volunteering, it seems to be that rise in sort of micro volunteering or less traditional ways of volunteering. So slight sort of shifts as we've had perhaps in the ways of work, perhaps we now have in the realm of volunteering as well. But the time well spent report, which might be interesting for you to read, will be published later on in this month. So that thing around obligations and thinking about you know, sort of creating obligations on people does have an impact potentially around the employment status, or it can impact on employment status. So volunteers are not usually obviously employees, they're not usually workers, and therefore they don't have the right to statutory employment rights, such as things like national minimum wage, statutory holiday or sick pay. They don't have a contract of employment, they're not paid for their time, nor do they typically have, you know, as I say, all the rights of an ordinary employee or worker. However, there can be a risk of the sort of blurring potentially of the status. So we tend to think that in status, there's no sort of legal description of a volunteer in law either, but we tend to think that we've kind of got a very basic level volunteers, then we have workers, then we have employees. It's not all clearly laid out in employment law, but hopefully that will happen soon. But there can be a risk of a sort of blurring between that line of volunteer and worker, or even volunteer and employee. And what matters in legal terms here is two things. One is what's the written contractual arrangement that you have between both parties, but then also what happens in practice. So we need to think about how do you contract or agree terms, if you like, with a volunteer, and then what happens in practice to mitigate the risks of inadvertently creating a status that might be worker or employee, whereby the individual could then say, actually, I think I'm a worker or an employee for your organisation, so I am now entitled to, you know, national minimum wage for the hours I work, holiday, etc., etc. So mitigating that risk, there's a few practical things that you can do. The first thing is can be really helpful to draw up a volunteer agreement, in that specifically specifying that there's no intention to create an employment contract. Now, again, you have to be mindful that a contract doesn't have to be written for it to be a legally binding contract. So again, it's thinking about what happens in practice. But a volunteer agreement that clearly sets out that this is a volunteering arrangement, the expectations that you would have of volunteers, what you will do in return for the volunteers, is a really good starting point. And we'll send out a copy of the slides after this session, but we do have, again, as part of Volunteers Week, a Managing Volunteers or toolkit that you can access, and that includes a template volunteer agreement that you can then tailor and use within your organisations. Second practical consideration, don't give volunteers an income. So volunteers can be reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses, so for example travel, subsistence, but they are out-of-pocket expenses, and technically you should collect their receipts, transport tickets, through your expenses claim process. It can sometimes seem more convenient to just give somebody a flat rate. You know, we'll give you £5 a day, but actually any amount over the actual expenses that individual incurs is known or can be referred to as consideration for the work that they've done. What that means is they are undertaking work for you. You are giving them payment for that because it's over and above their out-of-pocket expenses. So you are creating that worker or employment status through that practice, because they can say, actually, this is a consideration for the work that they've done. You're paying me. So in fact, I'm a worker and I'm an employee and I'm entitled to national minimum wage, etc. So be mindful and out-of-pocket expenses, and have that clear within the volunteer agreement. Again, be mindful of perks. It can be difficult if volunteers are used to getting perhaps additional sort of benefits, but clear perks. Now, that wouldn't be something such as if you had to issue protective personal equipment for somebody doing role, or a uniform, you know, if you had polo shirts for people working in a charity shop, etc. But if they do get things that are considered perks, that could be something of value. So if it was, say, training that wasn't necessary for the volunteering role that they were doing, that could be considered a perk. And again, there's a risk of that being considered as consideration for the work that they're doing for you as a volunteer, and creating that concept of a contractual relationship of worker or employee and organisation. And also be mindful of this creation of obligations. It can be difficult. Obviously, many organisations do ask volunteers to commit to minimum time periods, perhaps, you know, a minimum of 6 months. If possible, that should be avoided. And again, it should be that individuals are free to sort of end their volunteering arrangement with you, rather than having to commit to staying with you for a period of time, because again, that can create some of those obligations that, again, along with that consideration for pay, and perhaps if there's no volunteer agreement in place, all these things can stack up. And there's a risk that somebody could, through those things, actually claim that they're a worker or an employee. So basic thing, first thing, make sure you have a volunteer agreement in place, and secondly, look at what's happening in practice and make sure that there's nothing that's happening that could be creating that almost contractual relationship through giving the volunteer something other than out-of-pocket expenses or training that they might need to do for the job that could be considered as payment for the work that they're doing. So be mindful of that. In regards to sort of the legal framework, what applies to volunteers, what are your responsibilities and your obligations to those people who are volunteering for you? Volunteers have far fewer rights and less legal protection than paid staff, because there are key aspects of employment legislation that don't apply to volunteers, such as the Equality Act and the Employment Rights Act. However, there have been cases where a volunteer has claimed that employment status that we've just talked about of being actually, I think I'm an employee of this organisation. And therefore, through that process, they've been able to then determine that they've had an employment relationship with the organisation and therefore made claims of things such as discrimination, etc. But when it comes to the Equalities Act, although the Act doesn't mention volunteers and so it's not applicable to volunteers, technically, what you do have to be mindful of is that if you are, as an organisation, a provider of services and your volunteers are involved in the provision of those services, then the volunteer acting on your behalf could potentially, through their behaviours, actions, could be liable for discriminating against a service user through their own behaviours. So whilst you as an employer, or as an organisation, I should say, may not have obligations towards volunteers when it comes to preventing others from discriminating against that volunteer, as an organisation, that volunteer acting on your behalf could be liable to claims of discrimination from a service user if you are a service provider. So part of the sort of responsibilities that you have as an organisation would be to make volunteers aware of any policies and perhaps give them training in the areas of equality, diversity and inclusion, so that there's no risk then of a volunteer acting in a way which may be considered discriminatory against a service user of your organisation. One of the big obligations that you have as an organisation where you engage volunteers is around health and safety. The Health and Safety at Work Act, the definition of employee throughout that act is actually extended to include anyone who undertakes work for that organisation. So in that piece of legislation, volunteers will fall under the definition of employee. And in the Health and Safety at Work Act, you're obliged to obviously provide a healthy and a safe workplace for individuals. So that obligation will extend also to your volunteers. So again, making sure they're aware of your health and safety rules, your policies, provision of any sort of training that you might need to give to them in regards to health and safety, but also making sure that you're undertaking any risk assessments to ensure that your workplace, whatever the workplace is that those volunteers are engaged in work, is healthy and safe for those individuals to be able to work. So you do have obligations in regards to health and safety of your workplace to your volunteers as well as to your employees and workers. So that's just a little bit around the legal framework. As I say, it's really important that volunteers don't necessarily have a great deal of protection when it comes to employment law at the moment. The obvious exception to that is when it comes to health and safety. But actually what you need to remember is that particularly you have responsibility for what your volunteers may do if you are a provider of services, particularly around equality and diversity, to make sure that they are not discriminating against a service user in the course of their work. But typically the legal framework is much narrower when it comes to volunteers. But obviously what you need to be mindful of is that through your practices, that you're not unintentionally creating something that could be considered a contractual relationship of worker or employee, because obviously then the legal framework becomes expansive, and typically all of those employment rights would be applicable to if somebody were able to establish that they have employee status rather than volunteer status. So important to try and just get those basics, those practical considerations around how you're engaging and how you're perhaps your responsibilities and expectations are towards the volunteers right from the word go. So thinking about the volunteer journey throughout your organisation, then obviously typically that starts with attraction and selection. Then we move into engaging, as we just talked about, how you engage volunteers. Obviously the day-to-day managing of volunteers, and then typically an exit process. So a volunteer journey, if you like, looks quite similar to that might be a high-level journey for an employee. And in terms of looking to attract and select volunteers, we do recommend that you do put together a role profile that might be very similar to what you would put together as a job description if you were employing a role, but some kind of role profile that just gives an outline of, the roles, the activities that might be available within your organisation. And you can also use that to start to set out some of the expectations that you have of volunteers, and perhaps, again, some of the obligations that you have as an organisation as well. Attraction, typically advertising or making people aware of the vacancies can be done through a number of different ways, advertising open days, events, social media, your website, either as part of an ongoing campaign or when specific opportunities arise. But also there is third-party support that's available in terms of advertising or posting your volunteering roles. And I think towards the end of the session I've got a slide that links to a number of those volunteer organisations and boards that might be available to help you. There are also organisations that can help, or boards that might potentially help, job boards that might help if you're looking at micro volunteering. So if you have a specific project that you're looking for support with, so it's not an ongoing commitment, then again, there are some volunteer boards that are available, some websites available where you can organise or advertise those roles as well. When it comes to having received applications for the volunteer role, we do recommend that there is some kind of interview process. It might be more informal than that you undertake on an employment basis, but just really about trying to match volunteers with suitable opportunities, understand people's desire, the reasons why they're volunteering in your particular organisation. And then when it comes to actually wanting to make an offer to an individual, then again, we recommend that you use and agree the volunteer agreement with the individual at that stage, and obviously that you undertake any pre-employment checks that might be necessary for your organisation, for the roles. So it may be that you're asking for references. That could be from former employers or former volunteers where the organisation, where the individuals volunteered previously. It could be that you need to undertake a criminal records check through the DBS based on the work that the volunteer will be doing for you. If they're going to be undertaking any driving for you, it could be that it's checking things like driving licenses, if they're using their own vehicle, those checks to make sure that they have adequate insurance, MOT, etc. So again, there might be those pre-engagement checks that from a safeguarding, health and safety, and perhaps reputational basis, you want to undertake those pre-engagement checks. Then managing, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but typically we'd look at some form of induction, issuing the individual with a staff contact, making sure that health and safety arrangements are in place, that the organisation has adequate insurance that covers them for volunteers, making sure that there's somebody who can support in terms of perhaps coordination of what they're doing, looking at retaining and handling concerns. I'm going to come on to all of the sort of managing bits in a little bit more detail, but I'll just finish the sort of high level bit of the journey so far. And then once you've got to the point when perhaps a volunteer is leaving you, then there might be some exit processes that you need to follow. That could be things such as undertaking an exit interview. They might have equipment that needs to be returned to you, even if that's like an ID card, keys, if they've not been issued with obviously more significant pieces of equipment, and just closing them down, perhaps off your volunteering systems if you have those things in place. But one of the things that we said we talked about in more detail today on this session was the managing. So just looking at those things that we've talked about there in terms of induction. We do recommend that there is an induction process for volunteers because it's important to give them a welcome, an introduction to the organisation, to make sure that they understand who you are, your aims, values, your activities, how the organisation operates, who people are within the organisation or the team that they're working in. You can give a clear explanation of volunteer roles and activities, and again, following on from perhaps what's been in the role profile, the volunteer agreement, you can clarify expectations. So what the volunteer can expect from the organisation, so that you have health and safety in place, you have a staff contact, you have adequate insurance, this is how concerns are raised, but also so that vice versa, what the organisation would expect from the volunteer. So it could be setting out, what the volunteer activity is that they're going to be doing, who to contact if they're not going to be able to attend for a particular session when they've said they can. So you can set out all those types of expectations through that a volunteer agreement and then through the induction process. And also it's important to run through things such as health and safety, any of the working arrangements, procedures that you've got in place, and as we've said, sort of how to raise concerns or manage any problems that may arise. So an induction just helps with that whole process of setting expectations, so which hopefully you've started in the attraction and selection, you've covered off through the volunteer agreement, you're just making it explicitly clear again through the induction programme what the expectations are from both sides. In terms of a sort of staff contact, as an employee will normally have a line manager. I think it's helpful for a volunteer to be given a staff contact. So that could be somebody within the department or function they're working in. It could be somebody who acts as, say, a coordinator or administrator of volunteers, just somebody that person can go to if they have questions, queries or concerns. And it's helpful to make that clear who that person is through things like the volunteer agreement and the induction programme, and making those introductions through the induction programme as well. So that person knows who to go to if they have questions, queries or concerns. Health and safety and insurance, obviously, as we've talked about, you have an obligation to make sure that you're providing a healthy and a safe workplace for volunteers. So it is important that you do make sure that you have adequate policies, procedures in place, but also that you're making your volunteers aware of those and giving them any health and safety training that enables them to be able to perform the volunteering role safely. if there is anybody that's going to be administering or coordinating volunteers, then again, really important to make sure that the volunteers know who that person is, has contact details of that person, so that they can sort of maintain that ongoing relationship with them. In terms of sort of retention, and this is a real interesting question, I think when it comes to retention of volunteers, one of the things that can be really helpful is to look at understanding what are the personal motivators for either a group of, or probably more easily individual volunteers. Trying to identify what their personal motivators are. So what's the reason that they want to volunteer for your organisation? And that can typically come through your sort of informal selection processes, so interviews, if you have those with volunteers. And what you can try to do is try to ensure that what they do for you through your volunteering arrangement meets their motivations for giving time. It's interesting that, you know, what motivates people will typically vary from person to person, but volunteers will tend to be more satisfied in what they're doing, obviously, if the work that they're issued tends to meet what those personal motivators are. It is, you know, volunteering, it is a two-way arrangement. You know, yes, these individuals are giving their time for free to undertake work on behalf of your organisation, perhaps for the benefit of your service users, but they also themselves have expectations. And understanding these personal motivators, why that individual is motivated to do the work for you. For example, are they looking to develop new skills, skills that might potentially help them within their career? Then being able to try and meet those expectations is going to make for a better two-way relationship, and create what we tend to think of as a psychological contract between both parties. Now, that's very different to a physical contract, but a psychological contract happens when anybody, so employee, worker, volunteer, is doing work for an organisation. It's sort of that commitment that both parties have together. The reason why somebody wants to stay and do work for that organisation, perhaps the reason why they want to go above and beyond, is because they've got a sort of a psychological connection with the work that they're doing, the work that the organisation is trying to do, that their own personal expectations are being met. If that psychological contract breaks down, so for example, if the volunteers' expectations are not being met, then what that can result in is conflict, but also it can result in somebody saying, well, actually, I don't want to carry on with this volunteering relationship because I'm not getting out of it what I want. So I'm going to go and find that elsewhere. So trying to identify personal motivators, and where possible, looking to make sure what you're asking the volunteer to do meets those personal motivators, can create a stronger psychological contract that means that the individual is more committed, less likely to leave, less likely to look to do something else. So it's really about that sort of bond between the two parties. It might be that for organisations who have usually used the sort of more formal, ongoing approaches to volunteering, that looking at actually non-traditional approaches to volunteering may be something that they want to consider. So looking at sort of, you know, skills-based volunteering. So that could be somebody who perhaps is a qualified or a part-time or part qualified professional who perhaps through wanting to do CPD or expand their expertise in a particular area is looking to undertake some volunteering. So again, that might be, for example, somebody who's developing IT or technical skills, perhaps qualifications in IT, that they might say that they want to offer their time to an organisation, do their time free of charge, so on a volunteering basis, to help that organisation resolve current IT issues, develop websites, etc., etc. So it could be that skills based. We've got somebody who again, it's thinking about identifying their personal motivators, but somebody who has a specific skill. Or it could be that it's this micro volunteering approach. So again, that might be a specific somebody who wants to give small amount of time on a one-off basis. It could be for a specific task, might be a single task that could be achieved in a day or in a week, and that individual wants to volunteer in that way rather than creating an ongoing commitment with an organisation. And sometimes that might come through some corporate volunteering, so some larger organisations that might give their employees time to be able to undertake volunteering within their work time. So again, it could be that there's a specific day or week where a team or an individual might be able to volunteer for your organisation. So looking at those sort of non-traditional approaches to volunteering, as well as the more sort of formal ongoing volunteering arrangement, might be something to help, because that might meet more expectations or other expectations or personal motivators that people have. And again, providing recognition and feedback on performance and impact. That's one of the things that Volunteers Week is all set up to do, is about making sure that actually we recognise what volunteers do within the sector. And I think at an organisational level, making sure that you're providing recognition, giving people feedback on performance, recognising the impact that they're having on the wider organisation can be really helpful, because again, that can help strengthen that psychological contract that somebody feels that their performance is being recognised. Perhaps if the work is meeting their personal motivators and they can see the impact that that's having on service users or the wider community, that can really strengthen that psychological contract between both parties. And I think listen, engage with volunteers, make sure that they've got an assigned contact, and really, have that opportunity to have those conversations. So it is a two-way relationship. It shouldn't just be seen as a one-way relationship. So making sure people have got an assigned contact, listening to them, engaging with them, seeking feedback from them, but also providing recognition and feedback of their role. Those things will help strengthen the psychological contract. They shouldn't impact on whether somebody perceives there to be a physical employment contract between both parties, but they can just help strengthen the bond between the volunteer and the organisation, that can help potentially retain them. And obviously with what we've seen and what we talked about at the start of the session, that retention of volunteers could be something that's incredibly important at the moment. If there are any issues or concerns that are raised, then I think it's really helpful to make sure that you've got a clear process of how concerns that might be raised by a volunteer might be addressed, or what might happen if the organisation has concerns in respect of the volunteer themselves. So typically what we'd say is that right from the start, we would recommend that you communicate the process. So what is the process if a volunteer has a general concern or issue? Who should they go to? Normally, in the first instance, that would be the person who's taken on that role of staff contact for them. So be it a sort of line management role, be it a sort of volunteer coordinator role for the organisation. So they would normally be the person that the individual would go to first of all with the concern or query. Now, you may have policies or processes within your organisation that dictate what is the process that's followed if the individual raises a concern. That might be set out if you have a volunteer policy. There might be guidance in other policies. So as an example, whilst your grievance policy would not be applicable to a volunteer because it's a policy that only applies to employees, you may have something within the grievance policy that states that whilst that policy isn't applicable to volunteers, you may encourage the informal part of your grievance procedure to be used for resolving queries or concerns raised by volunteers. So typically, you know, if concerns are raised, then they should be raised with the staff contact. How they are dealt with would normally be set out either typically informally, and it may be set out within your volunteer policy or within your grievance policy. It may have something about the informal process. And it's just important, again, through that retention to make sure that concerns are heard, that there is some sort of informal process to look at the concerns that have been raised and to give an outcome to the individuals, because again, just following that process to seek to resolve that concern with the volunteer can help again with that sort of psychological contract between both parties. If there's a concern in regard to the volunteer themselves, perhaps performance, attendance, conduct, then again, policies that might be applicable to employees, such as perhaps disciplinary or capability, wouldn't be applicable to a volunteer. But we would always say that you would want to take a fair approach and discuss the concerns with the individual themselves to see if they can be resolved. You know, normally even in an employment relationship, you would look to have an informal discussion if there are, say, capability concerns, to try and get to the root cause of that and look to resolve that informally. So again, if there are issues or concerns, then the staff contact or sort of line management role might have that informal conversation with the individual to raise those concerns and try and understand what the root cause of them is and agree a way to resolve those concerns. Obviously, if it's a very serious issue that's arisen, or if concerns have been addressed and raised informally and still not resolved, then it may be that you're at the point of terminating the volunteer arrangement. And obviously, if you have a volunteer agreement in place, the exit process or the termination of that agreement will normally be set out within that document. And then again, it's thinking about managing that exit process. It might be, you know, return of equipment, you know, closing down files, folders, systems where you might have volunteer information held, etc. But again, that process would normally be set out within volunteer agreement and or potentially if you have a volunteer policy as well. So just in terms of, I referenced earlier some support from Roots HR. We do have, as part of Volunteers Week this week, we are offering a free volunteer toolkit, which is worth £188 plus VAT. We will send you round a copy of the slides because they have the link on to our webpage. But also, if you go to our website, and I've got details of that on the next slide, then you can access the free toolkit via the website as well. That is on offer available until the 7th, so it's just from the 1st to the 7th of June. As part of Volunteers Week, we are offering a free volunteer toolkit, which includes things like fact sheets, but also includes volunteer agreement as well. Roots HR also offer up to an hour of free HR consultancy to all social sector organisations. So again, there is a link on this slide, also information on our website. And there is some further guidance around managing volunteers that's available through the NCVO. So again, I've linked to that on this slide. And then, as I said, towards the start of the session, if you're looking at attracting volunteers, there are a couple of organisations and sort of volunteer job boards that you can use, and I've put links to a couple of those there. So we will share the slides and you can link to those there. But also for us, in terms of Roots HR, for any sort of HR queries, you can connect with us via LinkedIn, via Facebook, we are on Twitter, and also we have our website and contact details there as well. So again, those will all get shared with you at the end of following this session. We'll send out a copy of the slides so you've got all of those. So it just remains for me to say thank you for listening to that, and just to see now if we've got any questions.